Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. The topic of today's lecture is internal features of the midbrain. The external features of the midbrain we have already discussed in detail in previous lectures. But I will just briefly summarize the external features of the midbrain, because external features are reflected into the internal features of the midbrain also. So midbrain is the shortest segment of the brain. Midbrain, below midbrain is the pons, then medulla oblongata, which is continued downward as spinal cord. This is the midbrain or mesencephalon. Lateral view. Behind the pons and medulla oblongata is the cerebellum. Now cerebellum is connected to the brainstem, that is midbrain, pons and medulla oblongata, by three pairs of cerebellar peduncles. So the cerebellum is connected to the midbrain by a pair of superior cerebellar peduncle. Cerebellum is connected to the pons by a pair of middle cerebellar peduncle. And cerebellum is connected to the upper part of the medulla oblongata by inferior cerebellar peduncle. So this is midbrain lateral view. And this is superior cerebellar peduncle. Superior cerebellar peduncle of one side. So there is a pair of superior cerebellar peduncles which connect the cerebellum with the midbrain. Now it is somewhat cylindrical in shape, but for descriptive purposes I told you we describe the midbrain external features: front view, lateral view and posterior view. Now, anterior view of the midbrain. There are two rope-like structures known as the Crus cerebri. Right crus cerebrus and left crus cerebrus, which extends above from the cerebrum and below to the pons. And these two pillar-like structures, they are separated from each other by a fossa known as the interpeduncular fossa. interpeduncular fossa. And in the floor of interpeduncular fossa, there is posterior perforated substance. Now, posterior view of the midbrain. This was anterior view. Now, what are the external features of the posterior aspect of the midbrain? Now, suppose this is a posterior aspect of the midbrain. Then posterior aspect of the pons. And then medulla oblongata. And the posterior surface of the midbrain, there are 4 swellings, 2 superior colliculi and 2 inferior colliculi. This is a pair of superior colliculi. And below that is a pair of inferior colliculi. Pair of superior colliculi and a pair of inferior colliculi. And these 4 colliculi are separated from each other by a sulcus known as the cruciform sulcus. A horizontal part of the sulcus and a vertical part which cross, therefore it's called cruciform sulcus. And if we trace the lower part of the vertical part of the cruciform sulcus, it is converted into a ridge called frenulum vellae. And as I told you that the cerebellum is connected to the midbrain by a pair of superior cerebellar peduncle. So these peduncles enter the midbrain below the level of inferior colliculi. So here, suppose these are superior colliculi, right and left. Superior cerebral peduncle, sorry, not colliculi. A pair of superior cerebellar peduncles, one right and one left. And below the inferior colliculi and on each side of the frenulum vellae is the attachment of trochlear nerve. Posteriorly, on the medial surface of each crus, there is a sulcus known as the oculomotor sulcus or medial sulcus. Through it, the oculomotor nerve arises. Oculomotor nerve has surface attachment. And posteriorly is the trochlear nerve. So this was a summary of the external features of the posterior surface of the midbrain. These four colliculi are collectively known as the corpora quadrigemina. Corpus derived from body, four bodies, so corpora, quadri means four. Four elevations on the posterior surface of the midbrain. So these were external features of the posterior surface of the midbrain. Now what are the external features of the lateral aspect of the midbrain? Lateral view. Suppose this is lateral view of the midbrain. Below it is the pons. And then medulla oblongata. Now, above the level of this midbrain is the thalamus. Suppose we have dissected all the parts, leaving the thalamus. On the inferior surface of the posterior and or pulvinar of the thalamus, there is a swelling known as the lateral geniculate body. And another body known as the medial geniculate body. And you know, the lateral and medial geniculate body are collectively known as the metathalamus. This is lateral geniculate body and this is medial geniculate body. Now here you can see this is superior colliculus. Superior colliculus, and this is inferior colliculus. Lateral view of the superior and inferior colliculi we can see, and deep to the superior colliculus is the nucleus of the superior colliculus. And deep to the inferior colliculus is the nucleus of inferior colliculus. Now from the superior colliculus Around it, elevation extends forwards and upwards. This is known as brachium of superior colliculus. And then the elevation which connect the medial genital body with the inferior colliculus. This is known as brachium of the inferior colliculus. This is brachium of the inferior colliculus, which is between inferior colliculus and the medial geniculate body. And this is brachium of the superior colliculus, which is between the lateral genicular body and the superior colliculus. Now here there is another broad band elevation. This is known as the lateral lemniscus on the lateral surface of the midbrain. A tract which belongs to the auditory pathway, hearing pathway. This is known as the lateral lemniscus. Now, these are the external features of the lateral aspect of the midbrain. All these features in the previous lecture we have discussed in detail. So this was just a summary of the external features of the midbrain. Now, internal features of the midbrain. Now, midbrain in lower vertebrates, midbrain is the location of higher visual and auditory centers. In lower vertebrates, midbrain is the location of higher visual and auditory centers. In lower vertebrates, the higher center for audition and vision, hearing and vision is located in the midbrain. But in the mammals, these auditory and visual centers in the midbrain, they become the reflex centers. in mammals, these become the reflex visual and reflex auditory centers. Reflex visual center and reflex auditory center instead of higher centers. In mammals, the higher centers for the reflex visual and reflex auditory center, which are located in the midbrain, are transferred to the cerebral cortex. So higher visual and auditory center are in the cerebral cortex, but the reflex centers for audition and vision are in the midbrain in case of mammals. But in lower vertebrates, these are the higher visual auditory center located in the midbrain. Now this shifting of the higher center for vision and audition is known as the telencephalization. Telencephalization. The higher center for visual audition is shifted to the telencephalon cerebral cortex in case of mammals. Now, if we draw an arbitrary line in the middle of the midbrain, we can divide the midbrain into right and left equal halves. Now suppose this is a section through the midbrain. Section through the midbrain. This is ventral view, this is dorsal view, and this is section. If we draw an arbitrary line or imaginary line through the middle of the midbrain, we can divide the midbrain into right and left equal halves. This is an imaginary line. So right half and left half, suppose. Each half of the midbrain is known as the cerebral peduncle. Cerebral peduncle. This is right cerebral peduncle and this is left cerebral peduncle. Now do not confuse with cerebellar peduncles. Just before I told you the cerebellum is connected to the midbrain by a pair of superior cerebellar peduncle, to the pons by a pair of middle cerebral peduncle, and to the medulla oblongata by a pair of inferior cerebellar peduncle. These are cerebral peduncles because above the right half of the midbrain is right cerebral hemisphere. Now suppose this is front view of the midbrain. in pons and medulla oblongata. Now here is right cerebral hemisphere, and this is the left cerebral hemisphere. So you can see above the right half of the midbrain, or right cerebral peduncle, is the right cerebral hemisphere, and above the left cerebral peduncle is the left cerebral hemisphere. So these are cerebral peduncles, right and left. Cerebral peduncle. So each half of the midbrain is known as cerebral peduncle. Now each cerebral peduncle from before backward comprise of different parts. First of all is the crus cerebris. Crus cerebri, one right and one left. Behind the crus cerebris is substantia nigra. Substantia nigra behind crus cerebris. Then still behind the crus cerebris is the tegmentum. This is tegmentum of the midbrain. And still behind the most posterior part is known as the tectum. Tectum. So each half of the midbrain is known as the cerebral peduncle, and from before backward, each cerebral peduncle comprises of crus cerebri in front. Behind the crus cerebri is the substantia nigra, Still behind the substantia nigra is tegmentum, and the most dorsal part is known as the tectum. So in this way, each cerebral peduncle we divide into these parts from before backwards. Now this was about the cerebral peduncle, right and left. But you can see the two crura and the substantia nigra, they are bilaterally located. They are separated by a fissure known as the interpeduncular, by a fossa known as the interpeduncular fossa. Interpeduncular fossa. In other words, the right and left crus cerebri and the right and left substantia nigra, they do not fuse. They are separated by this fossa known as the interpeduncular fossa. But the tegmenta are continuous in the midline. Tectum is also continuous. The right tegmentum and tectum, where the left tegmentum and tectum, they are in the midline continuous with one another. It is only the substantia nigra and crus cerebri which are separated from each other by a midline fossa known as the interpeduncular fossa. So this was a summary of the structure of the cerebral peduncle in each half of the midbrain. Now just a summary of the internal structure. The crus cerebri, it is white matter. Substantia nigra, it is a gray matter. Tegmentum is a mixture of gray and white matter. Mixture of gray and white matter. And tectum, it also mixture of gray and white matter. So structurally, each crus cerebris is just white matter comprising of nerve fibers only. Then the substantia nigra is a mass of gray matter only, while tegmentum and tectum, these are mixture of both gray matter and white matter. Now internal structure of the midbrain varies. This is midbrain, superior colliculus, inferior colliculus, lateral view. Midbrain. Now this is level of superior colliculus. and this is level of inferior colliculus. So the structure of midbrain internal structure varies in the upper half and lower half. That is at the level of superior colliculus and level of inferior colliculus. But the structure of crus cerebri and substantia nigra are same at both levels. There are no structural differences in the crus cerebri and in the substantia nigra throughout the midbrain, from its upper end to the lower end. There is no structural difference of crus cerebri and substantia nigra in the upper half and lower half. Structure is same, but the structure of tegmentum and tectum vary. But the structure of tegmentum and tectum vary in upper and lower halves of the midbrain. Now we will discuss the internal structure, the structure of the crus cerebri, substantia nigra, the tegmentum and tectum. Now, first of all, what is the structure of crus cerebri? Now, this is right crus cerebrus, and this is left crus cerebrus, separated by interpeduncular fossa in the middle. Now each crus cerebri we divide into 3 parts. Crus cerebrus, as I told you, are pillars like structure comprised of white matter only, that is only nerve fibers. Nerve fibers running in the form of tracts, that is descending tracts. Descending are motor tracts. In each crus cerebrus, there is no gray matter, only white matter. And white matter is in the form of descending or motor tracts. These tracts arise from the cerebral cortex, descend through each cerebellum sphere, then enter the midbrain where they descend through the crus cerebri and continue into the ventral part of the pons and then medulla oblongata and then spinal cord. What are the tracts? They differ in these 3 parts of the midbrain. Now this is the medial part of crus cerebrus. This is intermediate part. Of the crus cerebrus, and this is lateral part. of the crus cerebrus. Medial part of the crus cerebrus, intermediate part of the crus cerebrus, and lateral part of the crus cerebrus. There are different descending tracts to these parts. What are the descending or motor tracts? Descending through the three parts of the crus cerebri. Now medial part. Then intermediate part. Of crus cerebri, and this is lateral part. Of crus cerebri. Now, what are the descending tracts descending through the medial part of the crus cerebri? These are corticopontine tracts. Corticopontine tracts are fibers. Now, corticopontine means they arise from the cerebral cortex and terminate in the pontine nuclei. So, corticopontine. But, we divided the cerebral hemisphere into frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, temporal lobe. So, each lobe has cerebral cortex. Now, these fibers which descend through the medial part of the crus cerebri, they arise from the cortex, descend through the crus cerebri of the midbrain, enter the pons where they terminate on pontine nuclei. But question arises, these corticopontine fibers arises from the cerebral cortex of which lobe? They arise from the frontal lobe. So corticopontine fibers are the frontopontine tracts, frontopontine. Fibers. They arise from the cerebral cortex, but cerebral cortex of which lobe? Frontal lobe. So corticopontine fibers are nothing but frontopontine fibers because they arise from the frontal cortex. They descend through the crus cerebri, medial part of the crus cerebri, enter the pons where they terminate in the pontine nuclei of same site. Ipsilateral pontine nuclei. Now these corticopontine frontopontine fibers, they are part of extrapyramidal system. They belong to extrapyramidal system. Belong to extra pyramidal system. You know, motor system we divide into pyramidal and extra pyramidal system. So which tracts descend through the medial part of the crus cerebri? Corticopontine, which arise from the cortex of the frontal lobe. Now next, which descending tracts? They descend through the intermediate part of the crus cerebral. These are corticorural fibers. Corticorural fibers. Corticonuclear fibers. And corticospinal fibers. Corticospinal fibers are tracts. Now, corticorural fibers, they arise from the cerebral cortex, descend through the intermediate part of the crus cerebri, and in the midbrain these fibers end at the red nucleus. Rubra means red. This is why these fibers are known as the corticorural fibers. They terminate in the red nucleus of midbrain. Red nucleus or nucleus rubra. Which is located in the midbrain. Next, the descending tracts descending through the intermediate part are corticonuclear fibers. They arise from the cerebral cortex and descend through the crus cerebri, intermediate part of the crus cerebri of the midbrain, then enter into the pons and then medulla oblongata. And in the medulla oblongata, they terminate in the motor nuclei of medulla oblongata. Now, these corticonuclear fibers are also known as corticobulbar fibers. Why corticobulbar fibers? Because the old name for the medulla oblongata is bulb. Corticonuclear or corticobulbar fibers. They enter the medulla oblongata and terminate in the motor nuclei of medulla. Next bundle of fibers are tracts which descend through the intermediate part. Which descend through the intermediate part are corticospinal fibers. Corticospinal fibers. And their name indicate that they arise from the cerebral cortex, descend through the midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata, and enter the spinal cord. and terminate in the spinal cord at different levels. These belong to pyramidal system. Because these tracts descend through the pyramid of the medulla oblongata, therefore they are also known as the pyramidal tracts. So they belong to the pyramidal system. And the corticopontine or frontopontine fibers belong to the extrapyramidal system. And these fibers, the tracts in the intermediate part, belong to the pyramidal system. Next, what are the descending tracts in the lateral part of the crus cerebri? These are also known as the corticopontine fibers. Corticopontine fibers. Now look here, through the medial part are corticopontine fibers, and through the lateral part again corticopontine fibers. But what is the difference? As I told you, there is a cortex of the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital, temporal lobe. So these corticopontine fibers, which descend through the medial part of the crus cerebri, they actually originate from the cortex of the frontal lobe. This is why these corticopontine fibers are called frontopontine fibers. Now what is left next to the frontal lobe is parietal lobe, occipital lobe, temporal lobe. So these corticopontine fibers, they arise from parietal lobe. They arise from the parietal lobe. So these fibers arising from the cortex of parietal lobe is known as the parieto-pontine fibers. Those which arise from the occipital lobe are known as the occipito-pontine. Occipito-pontine fibers, and those which arise from the cortex of the temporal lobe are temporopontine fibers. So I will repeat just briefly that the medial part of the crus cerebri, through it the corticopontine tracts descend, and through the lateral part of the crus cerebri also the corticopontine fibers or tracts they descend. Now what is the difference between these corticopontine fibers? The corticopontine fibers of the medial part are frontopontine because they arise from the cortex of the frontal lobe, while the corticopontine fibers which descend through the lateral part of the crus cerebri, they arise from the cortex of the parietal lobe, temporal lobe, occipital lobe. So there will be frontopontine fibers descending through the medial part of the crus cerebri. There will be parieto-pontine, occipito-pontine, and temporopontine fibers are descending through the lateral part of the crus cerebri. And the intermediate part, I told you, are the corticorubral, which descend from the cortex to end in the red nucleus of the midbrain. Then corticonuclear fibers descend, which arise from the cerebral motor cortex, and these fibers then end in the motor nuclei of the medulla oblongata. They are called corticonuclear or corticobulbar fibers. And then intermediate part again are the corticospinal fibers, which arise from the motor cortex, descend through the crus cerebri, intermediate part, descend to the pons, medulla oblongata, enter the spinal cord, and form corticospinal fibers. Because in the medulla oblongata, the corticospinal fibers descend through the pyramids. This is why these tracts are also known as the pyramidal tracts, and they belong to the pyramidal system. These corticopontine fibers, they also belong to the extrapyramidal system. So all these are descending or motor tracts, descending through the three parts of the crus cerebri, the midbrain: medial part, intermediate part, and lateral part. But here there is a arrangement of the cortical fibers or tracts according to the different parts of the human body. Now, medially will be the fibers for the head. In the intermediate part. Then will be the trunk and upper limb. And then will be the lower limb. Through the intermediate part, there is a specific arrangement of the fibers which belong to different parts of the human body, from medial to lateral side. Here will be the descending tracts for the head and neck region. Then lateral to it, descending tracts for upper limb and trunk. And still laterally will be the descending tracts for the lower limb. So there is a specific arrangement of these tracts in the intermediate part, from medial to lateral side, which represent different body parts. So this was about the internal structure of the crus cerebri, and this structure remained throughout the length of midbrain, from its upper end to the lower end. Whether it is upper half of the midbrain or lower half, same structure. Behind the crus cerebri, again separated ventrally by interpeduncular fossa, is the substantia nigra. Now, substantia nigra, it is a mass of gray matter, dark in appearance. And the substantia nigra of one cerebral peduncle is separated from the substantia nigra of the other cerebral peduncle by interpeduncular fossa. So substantia nigra are also not continuous with one another at the midline. They comprise of neurons. Now this substantia nigra, it is considered as a motor nucleus, a large motor nucleus. Substantia nigra is considered as a large motor nucleus. It is even visible to the naked eye. If we cut a section through the midbrain, with naked eye we can see. Substantia means substance, nigra means black, black substance. It appears black in color, in unstained preparation also. If you cut a fresh section of the midbrain, you will see substantia nigra with your naked eye. Why? Because the neurons of substantia nigra, they contain iron and neuromelanin. Now the substantia nigra is divided into two parts. Its dorsal part is more darkly stained, more compact, more dense. as compared to the ventral part. The neurons are closely packed in the dorsal part of the substantia nigra and is filled with the melanin, neuromelanin, and iron. So this more compact part of the substantia nigra, it is known as pars compacta. While the ventral part here, the neurons are loosely arranged, loosely dispersed, and it is known as pars reticularis. This is substantia nigra. So we divide the substantia nigra into these two parts. The dorsal part of the substantia nigra comprises of densely packed neurons filled with iron and neuromelanin. Therefore, it appears as a compact mass, so it's called pars compacta or pars densa, more dense. And the ventral part here, few neurons which are widely dispersed, not closely compact. So comparatively, this ventral part appears a little lighter in color as compared to the pars compacta. So it is known as the pars reticularis. So in this way, the substantia nigra we divide into pars reticularis in front and pars compacta behind. The neurons of the pars compacta they contain dopamine. They are occupied by dopamine. This is why they are dopaminergic neurons. Now the substantia nigra appear dark even with the naked eye in the first section. Why? Because the neurons, they contain neuromelanin and iron. And the neurons of the pars compacta contain dopamine. So the neurons of the pars compacta of the substantia nigra are dopaminergic neurons. So the structure of substantia nigra is same throughout the midbrain, from its upper end to its lower end. No structural differences, just like structure of the crus cerebri. Just same. Now behind the substantia nigra is the tegmentum. And tegmentum, I told you, it is a mixture of gray matter and white matter. Mixture of gray matter and white matter. Now, tegmentum of the midbrain. We discussed the crus cerebri in detail, and then we discussed the substantia nigra. Next is the tegmentum, which is between the substantia nigra in front and tectum behind. This is the tegmentum. Now, tegmentum, I told you, is a mixture of white matter and gray matter, various nuclei and various nerve fibers or tracts. Now, it is a mixture of white and gray matter. Now, in the middle, tegmentum is traversed by cerebral aqueduct. Now, this is imaginary line, so I will rub this because it is not an anatomical division. So, in the middle, the tegmentum is traversed by a canal known as the cerebral aqueduct. Now, cerebral aqueduct, it connects the third ventricle with the fourth ventricle. Now, suppose this is a section through the cerebrum, then section through the midbrain, here is the corpus callosum. Then anterior commissure, lamina terminalis, optic chiasma, spinal body connected to the posterior wall of the third ventricle, and this is posterior commissure. Here is the fornix, then septum pellucidum. This is a section through the pons. Then medulla oblongata. And behind the pons and upper part of the medulla oblongata is cerebellum. So here is lateral wall of the third ventricle, right diencephalon, and in the other part is the left diencephalon. So here is third ventricle. Now here between the pons and upper medulla oblongata and cerebellum, this is the fourth ventricle. And this is the midbrain through which cerebral aqueduct passes. cerebral aqueduct or aqueduct of Sylvius. Now here you can see this cerebral aqueduct which traverses through the midbrain, connect the third ventricle with the fourth ventricle. And below the fourth ventricle is continuous with the central canal of the medulla oblongata. In section, this is the cerebral aqueduct. Now the cerebral aqueduct, it is surrounded by a layer of gray matter known as central gray matter. Central gray matter. Or periaqueductal gray matter. So the tegmentum near its center, it is traversed by the cerebral aqueduct. Cerebral aqueduct is lined by ependyma, and the cerebral aqueduct connects the cavity of third ventricle with the fourth ventricle. And this cerebral aqueduct is surrounded by a gray matter known as the central gray matter or periaqueductal gray matter. This is a longitudinal section, and that is cross section. Now the central gray matter or the periaqueductal gray matter which surround the cerebral aqueduct. The cerebral aqueduct is lined by ependyma, and cerebrospinal fluid flows through it. The cerebral aqueduct surrounded by central gray matter is above, the central gray matter is above continuous with the gray matter of third ventricle, and below it is continuous with the gray matter of the floor of the fourth ventricle. This is floor of the fourth ventricle, partly formed by the pons and partly by the upper medulla, and this tent shape is the roof, and this is the cavity of fourth ventricle. So the central gray matter which surround the cerebral aqueduct in the midbrain is above continuous with the gray matter of the walls of the third ventricle, and below it is continuous with the gray matter of the floor of the fourth ventricle. Now in the tegmentum, I told you it is a mixture of gray matter and white matter. So the gray matter in the tegmentum is in the form of central gray matter. As I told you, it is also known as the periaqueductal gray matter. Then the gray matter is in the form of groups of neurons neuron groups forming various nuclei. And then there is a network of nerve fibers with gray matter known as the reticular formation. So the gray matter of tegmentum is in these three forms. Number one, the central gray matter or the peri-equidactal gray matter. Then there are groups of neurons scattered here and there in the form of nuclei. Peri-equidactal gray matter and in the form of nuclei and reticular formation. For example, here there is a nucleus, collection of neurons. For example, a nucleus here, another nucleus here. These we will discuss later on in detail. And there will be a reticular formation, a reticulum of nerve fibers. It's scattered gray matter. This is reticular formation. All these we will discuss later on in detail. So this is how gray matter is distributed in the tegmentum of the midbrain, in the form of central gray matter, in the form of different nuclei, and in the form of reticular formation. Next is the white matter in the gray matter. White matter in the tegmentum. Mostly there are ascending or sensory tracts. Mostly. I told you in the crus cerebri there are descending tracts, motor tracts from the motor cortex and other cortices of other lobes to the midbrain nuclei, medulla oblongata nuclei, and to the spinal cord. What are the nerve fibers or tracts traversing through the tegmentum of the midbrain? These are mainly sensory tracts. Different sensory tracts we will discuss later on in detail. Ascending tracts are sensory tracts. Sensory tracts. This is suppose red nucleus. These we will discuss later on in detail. And this is reticular formation and central gray matter and other nuclei. But few motor tracts. Few motor are descending tracts are in the tegmentum. Now, what are these few descending or motor tracts in the tegmentum of the midbrain? That is Corticorubral tract, tectobulbar or tectonuclear, tracts and tectospinal tracts. So few descending tracts or motor tracts. Tectobulbar. I told you this posterior part of the dorsalmost part of the midbrain is called tectum. Here there are tectal nuclei and pretectal nuclei. So the tract arises from the nuclei of the tectum and descend to enter the midbrain, where they end in the red nucleus cerebral. For example, this is a red nucleus. Here they tend. Second, tectobulbar or tectonuclear tracts arising from the tectum and descend through the midbrain, pons and medulla oblongata. In the medulla oblongata, they terminate in various motor nuclei. Tectobulbar, as I told you, the old name of medulla is bulb or tectonuclear, different motor nuclei of the midbrain. Next is the tectospinal tracts, as the name indicates, arise from the tectum and descend through the midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata, and enter the spinal cord, where they terminate at different levels. So these are the only motor or sensory tract descending through the tegmentum of the midbrain. Mainly the motor tracts or descending tracts descend through the crus cerebri. But here mainly are the sensory or ascending tracts in the tegmentum of the midbrain. Now structure of the tegmentum of the midbrain varies in the upper half of the midbrain and the lower. That we will discuss later on in detail. We will discuss the internal structure of the midbrain of the upper half of the internal structure of the upper half of the midbrain, that is at the level of superior calculus, and internal structure of the midbrain in the lower half, that is at the level of inferior calculus. So differences we will discuss later on. So this was about the tegmentum of the midbrain. And the most dorsal part of the midbrain is known as the tectum. Tectum is the dorsal most part of the midbrain. Dorsal part, and it comprises of the tectal nuclei and pretectal nuclei. The tectal nuclei are nucleus of superior colliculus and nucleus of inferior colliculus on each side. Tectum means roof. Tectum means roof. In midbrain, if you cut a section, it is like this. This is the cerebral aqueduct traversing it. This is superior cerebral peduncle, inferior cerebral peduncle. And you know there is pons, medulla oblongata, and then spinal cord. Midbrain traversed by the cerebral aqueduct. Now here inside the nucleus of superior calculus, nucleus of inferior calculus. Now it is like this. Just like a car, and this is roof of the car. So this is why this part is known as the tectum. Roof. And the nuclei are nucleus, nuclei of superior colliculi, nuclei of inferior colliculi, and pretectal nuclei are embedded in the tectum of the midbrain. So this was just a brief summary of the midbrain from upper end to the lower end. But there are structural differences in the midbrain at the level of superior calculus and at the level of inferior calculus. Superior calculus and at the level of inferior calculus. There are structural differences. But the structure of crus cerebri and structure of substantia nigra is same at all levels of the midbrain from its upper end to the lower end. But structure differences in the internal structure are in the tegmentum and tectum of the midbrain. That we will discuss in the next chapter. So thank you very much. Keep learning. Thank you.